Okay, good evening, brothers and sisters. It's been quite a while since my last lecture. I think it was something like 2-3 months ago. So it's in a dim past for probably all of us. I design my lectures in such a way that each lecture covers a specific topic which is self-contained. It's a standalone topic, like a TV series, you know. But each lecture is linked to the other lectures so that in the end we get a complete story of what it is we're talking about. And that way you'll get in the end the complete picture, a larger story. And so what is this story? It's about spiritual survival in the 21st century. That presupposes that there is a difference between what's happening now and in the past, and certainly that is the case. Spiritual warfare has now changed drastically. Just give a sort of worldly example, perhaps. This more applies to the younger generation. So imagine living in a world where there are no computers and there's no internet. So if you're taken in a time machine and back you go to when that happened, and how do you think you would survive? How would you live? I'll give a little example from my experience. When I graduated as an engineer, this is decades ago, in that era there indeed were no personal computers, and there was certainly no internet. The only computers that they had were what were called mainframe computers. And those computers, the mainframe, which take up a whole building, they were not as powerful as your mobile phone is today. The first time that I came across an electronic device, it was a calculator, a HP Hewlett-Packard 35 calculator. That was in 1972. I'd already been working for some 3 years by that stage. I noticed one of my younger engineers holding something in his hand. He's plonking away there. And I said, "Roger, what is that thing that you've got there?" And he said, "It's an electronic calculator." And I said, "What's that?" And he looked at me with a smile and showed me how this thing worked. First time ever. Before that, we used slide rules. So it was a completely different era. Like almost two different universes that we lived in, that I transitioned from one to the other. Now, so that was basically when I started engineering. It was about 60 years ago. And this difference in lifestyles between then and now is quite monumental. But that difference doesn't compare to the difference in the intensity of modern spiritual warfare compared to the warfare that existed for 2,000 years since the time of Christ. So until the 21st century, there's one version of spiritual warfare for each of our souls, and now it's changed tact completely, and it's far more dangerous now. Earlier, in my previous lectures, I mentioned that the basic form of spiritual warfare focused on heresies. So fundamentally, everybody believed in some sort of a god, more or less, and it was just the arguments were what each god taught, who was right, who was wrong, but there was essentially a god. The warfare has changed completely to such an extent where the world doesn't care about what the church teaches, doesn't care about heresies. It's attacking God himself. So, and the last time that happened, when God was attacked, was in fact when Lucifer challenged God back way in heaven before we were even created. And he, of course, lost that warfare. How this warfare, the modern version of spiritual warfare, is conducted in our era, that is the essence of all these lectures that I'm doing. So I want to do a very quick review of the stuff that we covered previously so that we can sort of see the relationship, and then we'll pick up to something new. The first lecture that I gave back in May, that was simply called from memory, Science is Theology. It wasn't science and theology like most people think. Science is theology. So why is this important? There are a number of reasons. Firstly, Jesus showed his divinity using science by manipulating the laws of nature. Jesus literally wrote the laws of nature mathematically into the universe. And now scientists, they decode what they see and then write this down mathematically. We're really referring to cosmologists and physicists, basically. Now, and then we have, on the other hand, you have atheists. They use science, or they pretend to use science, to negate God, to convince the masses that God doesn't really exist. So the irony is this. Jesus uses science, or used science, to save us. How? Through science he showed his divinity. He is God. He needed to do that. Conversely, atheists abuse science to show that God doesn't exist. Science is the battleground. That was essentially our first lecture. Then we proceeded to lecture 2, where we developed a schematic model that showed the relationship between God, man, meaning man, woman, Adam and Eve, and the animal kingdom, which means the universe. I show this in this talk as slide 1 in this. So we've got a relationship, a theological relationship between man, God, nature, universe. So that sounds all very good, except it's not really. Incidentally, this model, by showing this relationship, also explains things like natural disasters and earthquakes and pestilence and indeed COVID, if you like. So from that theological model, pictorial model, we realised that even though it was technically, theologically correct, it was not sufficient, because it really applied and applies to preaching to the converted, to preaching to the believers. Its main weakness, this is what the atheistic people point out, is that there's absolutely no evidence that that theological model is sound, correct. There's no evidence for that. That's what they claim. And so what they say is that because there's no evidence, we're really talking a spiritual version of theology, and that then translates to faith, that famous magic word, faith. Atheists take great delight in denouncing faith, denouncing the church really, because it's so reliant upon faith. And the irony is that while atheism itself is also faith-based, because if you had no God, there would be no atheists, because atheist is an attack on God. So they too are faith-based, but we are not just faith-based, and this is what we'll be looking at. To illustrate how the role that science plays in modern warfare, in one of my earlier lectures, I'm not sure, maybe lecture 2, lecture 3 or something, I produced a chart that used data from the census, Australian census, and it showed on the vertical axis the percentage of the population that said it was Christian. And if you go back to the year 2006, 64% of Australia's population said they were Christian. 5 years later, in 2011, that figure dropped from 64% to 61%. Not dramatic, but it's a drop. Then another 5 years, 2016, we're now down to 52% of the population says it's Christian. That's 2016. And if you plot that graph as Christianity plummets, the graph estimates that we will, for the first time, have a population well below 50% that is Christian. The typical figure that I think will be around 43%. Now, the same graph you will see, there's a big red circle in the year 2016, and that refers to the age group of between 25 and 34 years. That's sort of the youth entering adulthood period. And while the general population, 52%, claimed to be Christian, out of this new age group within that bracket the same year, the number of younger people dropped to 38%. So 38% of the younger generation now admit that they are Christian. You see what's happening? And again, using my estimate for this coming year, that'll drop to about 30%. And the thing that you have to understand is that because Orthodox youth are part of society, our society, Western society, they too are affected by the same factors and influences in this world. And so they too will go down the same trend, the path to perdition in the end. That is slide 2. And that's so significant. The other thing I might add here is that no matter how hard we try, theologians, priests, seminaries are still very content to stick to the old ways, to teach what has been taught for 2,000 years or so. And as if that is sufficient. Well, if that was sufficient, and what we're doing now is the same as what we did in 2016, if that was sufficient for our youth, they would not be now at the 38% mark. They'd be around the 60% mark. The fact that there is a fall indicates that current theology is not doing its job. There is a massive hole there. And that is something that the church, Christianity itself, needs to recognise and address. I already discussed this in detail before, so this is just a little summary of what we talked about previously. Christ's miracles comply fully with the scientific definition of evidence or proof. So, Christ's miracles are not fancy-pantsy stuff that someone invented. They comply by the definition that scientists use to define what is evidence. And attempts to belittle Jesus' miracles, those attempts are themselves not scientific. It's falsehood. So that's the first bit. And the next bit was to show why miracles are scientific, is that the laws of nature, we also saw this, the laws of nature obey humans. That might have been my last lecture. And why does this happen? Because we are made in God's image, and so we represent God, and because both the universe and the laws of nature were made for us, therefore they have to obey us. It's been demonstrated in my earlier work. I demonstrated that, showed one example of how at the microscopic level, commonly called quantum mechanics, laws of nature obey us. You can have a look at that. That goes in a fair bit of detail. So that's the scientific input at a little level, microscopic level. In later lectures, we will talk about this false science which atheists use to attack Christianity in particular, and religion in general. So they are sort of forthcoming down the track somewhere, how this all works. Here, I want to point out that even though science is the very foundation of modern-day spiritual warfare, it is not the only weapon that the enemy uses. And so I'll give an example here. Secular historians and philosophers, they're prone to exaggerating and fabricating evidence that contradicts Scripture. One of their favourite accusations is to dispute the authenticity of the Gospels and the letters that St. Paul wrote and so on. And how they do this, they say, well, there is not one document that exists from that era to prove that the Gospels were legit. Okay. What happened was, when the Gospels were written, they were written a few decades after Christ got crucified. And those Gospels, once they were written, they were very, very quickly translated into multiple other languages. So that even if the original documents, the handwritten documents, vanished for whatever reason, because you had multiple translations in different languages, there may be a bit of conflict with this language and a bit of conflict with that language, but when you compare all the languages together, you will get the complete picture. The whole original set of Gospels and all Scripture could be recreated from that fact alone, because it was done very soon after Christ got crucified. Now, we go to slide 3, and I want to show how these historians muck things up, how they cheated a little bit. So slide 3 is titled Dating of Ancient Secular Manuscripts. There are, in fact, a lot of people I could have quoted, but I quote two, just so that they get bogged down. I quote Aristotle, and I quote Julius Caesar. None of those two guys science can't prove that they existed, just like science can't prove that you exist or that I exist. It's a different form of evidence here. But we'll look at this document here. Aristotle, his stuff that he wrote occurred during the period 384 to 322 BC, right? The earliest copy of what he wrote surfaced 1100 AD. So in other words, the earliest reference manuscript that refers to Aristotle occurred 1400 years down the track. So when atheists say we don't have original biblical material, what about that, huh? And then we'll talk about Julius Caesar. He lived from between 100 and 44 BC. And the earliest copy of any manuscripts that refer to him appeared 900 AD. He lived BC. So it's just exactly 1,000 years later is the first document that confirms that Julius Caesar lived then. And there are 10 such copies in existence. They're called extant copies. And Aristotle, there are 5. So again, what I'm getting at here is that when it comes to secular manuscripts, the original source and the first copies, because that source is gone, and so the first copies, they go like 1,000, 1,400 years down the track, and there's no problem. Everyone's happy with that. No one will deny that Julius Caesar didn't exist. No one will deny that Aristotle didn't exist. But here we go. Comes the Bible, and the documents are written very soon afterwards, and that's not good enough. That's deficient, no evidence for that. All right, so this table that I just referred to, slide 3, that was for secular manuscripts. And I did a very similar thing in slide 4, where we look at ancient biblical manuscripts. And there are three that I will refer to that we've got little pieces. And one is called, you'll see on the screen, Codex Vatinicus, that refers to the Bible. That was written in the 1st century, and the earliest copy is from 325 to 350 AD. So it's somewhere between 275 years later to 300 years later. Not 1,000 years or 1,500 years or whatever, around maximum 300 years difference. Codex Sinaiticus also refers to the Bible, also 1st century. It's the earliest copy that we have is 35 AD. And so, again, a teeny-weeny span. The third one, Codex Alexandrinus, again refers to the Bible, 1st century, 400 AD, 350 years after Christ. So the time spans between original biblical manuscripts and the earliest copies range from 275 years to 350 years, okay? Copies of that. The time spans for secular manuscripts are vastly longer. I mentioned Aristotle, 1,400 years, Caesar, 1,000 years. So this is where there's a sort of hypocrisy here when these academics try to disprove the authenticity of the Bible using this dating technique. Okay. So clearly there's a massive bias by secular historians. They are very much anti-Christian. Now, so that's sort of the background of what we've done to date, more or less. Today's lecture is on a different topic. You probably heard of this. It's about the Holy Fire in Jerusalem. That'll be the title of my lecture. So that's literally today's talk. The Holy Fire, it's a flame that appears miraculously every year, that is, the Saturday before Easter Sunday, one day earlier. This Holy Fire appears by itself. It lights candles. We'll see examples of this, including photographs. And that's done in Christ's tomb. And Christ's tomb is located in a large church called the Church of Resurrection, also known as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So we'll see a few things there. And it'll be quite clear where we're getting at. So far I showed that the laws of nature obey mankind at the minute level, microscopic. Today we're going into macroscopic, the big deal world, the real world that we can see. Okay. It's actually believed, theologians believe this, that this holy light first appeared for the first time during the resurrection of Jesus, after midnight on Holy Saturday and a few hours before dawn of Easter Sunday, and most likely on a date of 5th of April AD 33. That's what the theological conclusion is. This event has been physically recorded, the earliest records we got, has been recorded every year for the last 12 centuries. So we've got case studies there. I was fortunate enough to witness the Holy Fire when I went with a group of pilgrims to Jerusalem back in 1993, a long time ago. And so I'll describe this Holy Fire in that context. All right. Now, first I'll show a slide 5, that shows you the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. That's what it looks like. You will see it's a church. There are 2 domes, a big dome and a smaller dome. That's part of the same church. And under the big dome, I'll show you in a minute again, that's where Christ's tomb is located. When people gather there to get that fire, it's actually been written, and I've heard that you're talking somewhere like 10,000 people are present, maybe more, maybe 12,000 people are present. So anyhow, so have a look. Slide 5 is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. We're going to zoom inside now. All right, so you can see Christ's tomb. Basically, it was like a little mountain or a little hill with a cave inside, and Christ was buried in that cave, and subsequently the church built a little building around that, and you can see this building, this tomb, on slide 6. That is in the middle of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre with a big dome. So underneath there, on this particular slide, that's not at Easter, about a year or two ago, the Christ's tomb was sort of fixed up a bit. It was things were falling apart, and so doing work on that. That's the workmen largely around there, but it's a clear picture. Okay, so that's Christ's tomb where everything happens. I managed to get on both slide 7 and slide 8 a cutaway model of both the Church of Holy Sepulchre and a cutaway model of Christ's tomb. It's really informative, very instructive. I got that from nationalgeographic.com. So if you have a look at slide 7, I'm looking at my bit of paper here, but you can see it on the screen. And so, as we described, under the big dome, you have the little building there, and that's where Christ's tomb is. And on that picture, the entry into the tomb is from our right to left. Now we go to slide 8, which is Christ's tomb itself, and you can see where Christ's body laid in that model. And so that's where everything happens. And so when the patriarch, the Greek Orthodox patriarch, goes into that tomb on Saturday, that's where the fire comes and all things happen there. So now I might sort of describe our situation with our little group of pilgrims. We got there probably just before sunrise, I think, and already it was outside the church. Everything was locked, and people start to accumulate in their multitudes. Then eventually the doors were opened to go in, and the rush started, and you really had to lock hands not to get ripped apart. Our group ended up, I'll tell you where, if you look at slide 8, where we are looking at slide 8, that's where we were physically, but closer to the tomb. So that's where we saw things happen. Around about 10 a.m, stuff like Star Wars started to happen. At first in the distance I could see blue flashes, and I thought they were just camera flashes, but they were blue. And then they became more frequent. I really can't recall, it was certainly for an hour, maybe 2 hours, like that. And then, I mentioned Star Wars, a lot of that blue light appeared and manifested itself like a cylinder. That sort of diameter. One of those, I was watching, it came from my right, and it came heading towards me, where people were standing next to me, and I had to duck. I ducked like that, and it went whoosh right past me. It was about that long, that diameter. The crowd started to make a big noise. Feet were stamping, people were sort of yelling in different languages possibly. And that's when the patriarch came out of Christ's tomb with 2 sets of large candles all lit up. And he then passed that flame to other people holding candles. And so within 2 minutes, some 12,000 people's candles were lit. There were bundles of 33 candles, about that diameter. And so the flame was passed on. Some people's candles lit automatically by themselves. Also, what's lampada in English? Oil lamp. the oil lamps on the wall, you would see them fire up by themselves. The fire would start and they would light up. And so that's all quite exciting anyhow. Most people would receive their flame from their neighbour. That's what we did. So what's the big deal? The big deal is this, that certainly in our case, and it always happens, but the time frame is, I'll explain. In our case, that fire did not burn. That fire was cold. It was quite large. The flames were quite large. You'll see I've got the photographs here. And you could put the flame over your hand. In my case, I do this on and off for like 20 minutes. And then the flame would get warmer. Also, people put the flames over their faces and grab their hair. One of the novices, who's now one of our nuns in Australia, she grabbed her hair, put the flame, and you could just hear, psst, nothing. No, it didn't burn. And so that fire had different qualities. You know, it's not even remotely comparable with people doing this firewalking stuff. When you do firewalking in engineering, there's a thing called an adiabatic process. And what that means is a process that happens so quickly that there's no time for heat to transfer. And so if you've got thick solids and stuff, you can do that. This is nothing of the sort. The fire is cold, does not burn. And it's really remarkable. So when people say that unless God reveals himself and proves that he's there, I won't believe in him, all of this stuff that we witness, and you can witness, has been happening every single year, and it's not restricted to Orthodox people. If any atheists are watching, guess what, buddy? I invite you to go there next Easter, or any Easter you suggest you like, choose your time frame, and you will experience that. And then you will know. Okay? I'll just add this little bit here. Why is this stuff scientific? Oops, that's the one that I was looking at. Okay, you're looking at on the screen. Why is it scientific? Because there's a direct correlation between the laws of nature behaving differently, so they behave differently, but always the day preceding Easter Sunday. And because Easter is a movable feast, therefore that event occurs, it's a movable event. So it's not that something that's created, there was some sort of an anomaly in the building or whatever. It sort of follows the Easter cycle, Easter itself. So there's a link to Easter. There's a link to the divine, a physical link. And secondly, because this event can be predicted, that makes it even more scientific, because the very essence of science, certainly again in the hard sciences, the physics and the cosmology and so on, chemistry, what makes something scientific is the fact that it can be replicated, it can be predicted, you can predict the outcome. So here, I haven't got this on the screen, so I'll read this out. Here are the dates for when this holy fire will appear for the next 5 years. I've dug that up for you. This year, it'll happen on the 1st of May. The time frame, it's a Saturday, it's always a Saturday. The time frame is roughly between 10 a.m. and probably maybe up to 2 p.m. So it sort of varies in between there, but it happens. So 1st of May this year, next year, 11th of June, 2:23, 4th of June, 2:24, 22nd of June, 2:25, 7th of June. So there's the predictions, a theological prediction of a scientific event. It's scientific because it can be measured scientifically. You can measure cold, not cold, burns, doesn't burn, all sort of stuff. So So all the bases I consider are covered. So if you're serious, not just someone who just doesn't think deeply, but if you're serious about the afterlife, about your soul, about the future, and whether you believe or not, it's in your interest to go at least once in a lifetime and witness this. So again, I invite witnesses, atheists to witness that, because that could literally save your souls if you're serious. On the other hand, I invite Christians to attend, because that will definitely strengthen your faith. I think that is the end of my talk today. Thank you.